Let's be honest, how many times have you read a fantasy novel where the elves are always noble, the orcs are always evil, and the dwarves are always gruff miners with a thirst for ale? And don't even get me started on the dark and seductive vampires, or werewolves being tortured loners, trying to hide their violent impulses. Why do some fantasy races feel so lifeless, while others leave an impression? Today we're discussing what makes a fantasy race memorable, and what a lot of writers get wrong while creating them. So stick around, because your fantasy world is about to get a whole lot more interesting, thanks to the creatures and cultures populating it. First, we need to understand what authors have been doing wrong when it comes to fantasy races. Let's address the three most recurring problems. Fantasy races are often reduced to shallow, one-dimensional tropes that fail to evolve or challenge reader expectations. For instance, elves are frequently portrayed as noble, wise, and superior, while orcs are pigeonholed as brutish and evil. These oversimplified depictions rob these races of complexity and make them feel predictable. This kind of stereotyping can diminish the impact of a story, as it reinforces the idea that certain races are inherently good or bad, without any nuance or character development. When races are confined to fixed roles, they lose their potential to surprise or engage the audience, becoming mere tools to fill archetypal roles, rather than contributing to the richness of the world or the narrative. Which leads us to the second problem, which is lack of diversity within the races. A common mistake in fantasy writing is treating an entire race as a monolithic culture, where every member shares the same trait, beliefs, and behavior. This lack of diversity within a race can make the world feel flat and unrealistic. Think of the Vulcans in Star Trek. They are typically depicted as a purely logical, emotionless race that follows a strict code of logic, with very little deviation or internal cultural differences explored. Just as humans are diverse, with different cultures, values, and perspectives, fantasy races should have internal complexity. A more nuanced approach shows that not all elves are ethereal and perfect, and not all orcs are mindless brutes. Introducing variations, factions, or subcultures within a race can make them feel more alive and believable. The third problem is lack of plot relevance. In some stories, fantasy races are introduced simply to add variety or visual diversity without contributing meaningfully to the plot. This results in races that feel tacked on, existing solely for superficial reasons. When a race doesn't affect the story's core elements, like driving the plot forward, influencing character decisions, or representing a thematic idea, it can feel like an afterthought. Every race introduced into a story should have a clear reason to exist within the world, whether they add to the political dynamics, highlight cultural tensions, or represent a key theme in the narrative. Without this, races become window dressing rather than essential pieces of the world's puzzle. So, to recap, avoid stereotypes and clichés, avoid making each race monolithic, with every individual within that race behaving the same and believing the same things. Make sure the race you're introducing has relevance to the plot. You shouldn't add races just to make the world feel more diverse, and if you really want to add them, make them contribute to the plot in some way, or at least make them contribute to characterization in some shape or form. Now, here are some tips to do it right. First, make races distinctive enough from each other. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien masterfully distinguishes each race through unique cultures, languages, appearances, and values. The ethereal elves are deeply connected to nature, immortal and graceful, speaking in their own elegant tongue, while their architecture reflects their harmony with the natural world. In contrast, the dwarves are rugged, earthbound miners with a culture centered on craftsmanship, stonework, and underground strongholds. Their speech is more guttural, reflecting their no-nonsense, pragmatic nature. The Rohirrim, a human race, are nomadic horse lords, defined by their connection to the land and their warlike yet honorable culture. Through these distinct differences, Tolkien ensures that each race feels like a complete and separate society with its own identity, with different beliefs, architecture, cuisine, and even sense of style. This second tip is another strength from Tolkien, which is adding real-world symbolism to these races. For example, the simple rural hobbits represent a peaceful, pastoral life, in contrast to the industrialization represented by Saruman's orcs, who destroy nature in their pursuit of power. The clash between these races symbolizes the tension between nature and industrial progress, a theme that reflects Tolkien's own concerns about the changing world in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. The orcs, with their machinery and destructive forces, embody the threat of industrialization consuming the natural world, while the hobbits represent a more innocent agrarian ideal. This symbolism enhances the thematic depth of the story, making the races reflections of real human concerns. A third tip is tied to something we already discussed in the common mistakes, which is to make sure that your races are not monolithic. A well-crafted fantasy race should have internal diversity, adding complexity and realism to the world. In the Witcher series, for example, elves are not just portrayed as noble victims of oppression, but are also shown to be capable of cruelty and arrogance themselves. While they are oppressed by humans, some elven factions are militant and violent, while others seek peaceful coexistence or assimilation. This internal division shows that no race is entirely good or bad, but instead has a range of perspectives and moral alignments. This complexity makes the elves a more nuanced race, avoiding the trap of one-dimensional portrayal, and gives them a significant role in the series' exploration of racial tensions and power dynamics. Consider today's political, climate, and social discussions. It is extremely reductive to equate a human ethnicity or the human race as a whole to a finite set of characteristics. Why should it be different in your fantasy world? So, to recap those good practices, make sure the races you're including in your story are distinctive enough from each other. Use elements such as language, way of speaking, appearance, values, and even architecture and clothing to make them distinct. Also, make sure you're saying something with the addition of the race to the story. What do they symbolize, and what is this race commenting on? Finally, make sure that there are different factions within that race, and not everybody there acts the same. It doesn't work like that in real life, and it shouldn't work like that in your fantasy story. Fantasy races, themes, and plot. Now, we should also address how fantasy races can be used as a tool to convey your themes and move your plot forward. If you watched other videos on this channel, you know that I won't shut up about how you should leverage your story elements to make your themes hit stronger and make your plot more dynamic. And with fantasy races, this should be no different. Fantasy races should be deeply tied to the core themes of a story, making their existence resonate on a thematic level. In the Poppy War, the race of the Spearleys reflects the themes of genocide, cultural loss, and the burden of trauma. The Spearleys, once a powerful race with unique shamanic abilities, were nearly wiped out by the Federation in a brutal genocide. Rin, the protagonist, struggles with her identity as one of the last remaining Spearleys and grapples with the powers they possess. The Spearleys' history of destruction and loss mirrors the story's broader themes of imperialism, the consequences of war, and the trauma of cultural extinction. The race's existence highlights the tragic cost of conflict and the lingering scars of violence, resonating with the story's dark historical themes. Introducing a fantasy race into a story should always serve a plot-driven purpose, shaping key events and influencing character growth or conflict. In The Hobbit, the dwarves' quest to reclaim their lost homeland of Erebor drives the entire plot forward. Thorin Oakenshield and his company's journey to reclaim the Lonely Mountain from the Dragon's Maug is a central storyline that influences every major event in the book. This quest for their lost home defines their character arcs, introduces conflicts with other races like the elves and men, and sets the stage for the climactic battle of the Five Armies. Without the dwarves' deep connection to their homeland and their desire for restoration, The Hobbit's central narrative would lose much of its drive and emotional resonance. Races can be a source of rich tension and conflict, both externally between different groups and internally within their own societies. In Dark Souls, there is a clear tension between humans, gods, and other beings like the undead. The gods, led by Gwyn and his pantheon, have a clear sense of superiority over humans, viewing them as lesser beings. This leads to the establishment of the Age of Fire, where the gods maintain control, while humans are relegated to the shadows, often becoming undead and cursed. The undead, who are essentially cursed humans, are treated as outcasts and threats to society. They are hunted and imprisoned in places like the Undead Asylum. The societal disdain for the undead drives much of the tension and isolation felt by the protagonist. The divide between the undead and the gods reflects the broader theme of decay and the inevitable fall of those in power. Using races for characterization can be a powerful tool to highlight a character's individuality and internal conflict. For example, you can establish that a certain race behaves in a specific way, whether through cultural norms, values, or common behaviors, then establish a character who challenges or deviates from these expectations. The Asgardians in the Thor lore are often portrayed as a powerful, godlike race with strong ties to honor, combat, and Norse mythology. Thor starts as the embodiment of Asgardian pride and warrior culture, but through his journey, he grows into a more thoughtful and responsible leader who questions the imperialistic history of Asgard. If a race is known for being honor-bound and strict, a character who questions these traditions or seeks a different path immediately stands out. Their race serves as a mirror to their personal beliefs, helping to define their motivations and personality. This approach not only deepens the character's development, but also enriches the race's portrayal by showing that no culture is monolithic. It allows for internal diversity, showing that individuals within a race can possess a wide range of thoughts and values, creating a dynamic and nuanced narrative. This technique helps establish a character's complexity, using their cultural background as a contrast to their unique journey and struggles. Now, we should also discuss if it's better to create our own races or just utilize the ones that are already established in fantasy. The answer is, it depends. Let's get a bit deeper into this. Using existing fantasy races, such as elves, dwarves, orcs, or vampires, can be beneficial when you want to tap into established archetypes and quickly convey certain traits or values to the audience. These races come with a built-in understanding, allowing readers to immediately grasp their characteristics, such as elves being ethereal or dwarves being industrious, without needing extensive explanations. This is particularly useful when you want to focus on other elements of the story, such as the plot or character development, without dedicating too much time to world building. Existing races are also helpful when you want to play with or subvert expectations. For instance, introducing an elf who defies the noble stereotype adds a layer of depth and surprise to the character while still leveraging the familiarity of the race. Overall, using existing fantasy races works best when you want to streamline world building or engage readers through familiar elements while still having the opportunity to innovate. Creating your own fantasy races from scratch, however, offers you the freedom to fully customize the culture, biology, and history of a race to fit the unique themes and world of your story. This is ideal when you want the races in your world to reflect original concepts or embody themes not typically associated with established races. For example, if your story revolves around the idea of symbiosis and interdependence, creating a race that relies on a symbiotic relationship with nature or another species could be far more effective than using existing races. Original races also allow you to explore moral complexities specific to your world, adding depth to the narrative. When building a race from scratch, you can make them integral to the world's history, politics, and ecosystem in a way that feels fresh and tailored to your story's needs. To summarize everything we talked about so far, creating memorable fantasy races requires more than just borrowing from existing stereotypes or adding surface-level diversity. Try to avoid shallow clichés, such as reducing races to one-dimensional traits or treating them as monolithic cultures, and instead focus on making them distinctive and tied to your story's themes. You can build a more immersive world. Fantasy races should resonate with your plot, characters, driving conflicts, and enriching your narrative. Whether you choose to use existing races to subvert expectations or craft new ones to reflect original ideas, always ensure that the races in your story serve a deeper purpose. They should influence the characters' journeys, reflect the themes of the story, and help create a world that feels complex and alive. So, when writing your fantasy, make your races count, because in the end, the world they help build can elevate your entire story. That's it for the video today. Comment below some examples that come to mind of fantasy races that were particularly well written, subverted expectations, or highlighted the story themes well. Also, mention some examples of stories that did this poorly. Let's discuss. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. You heard this before, so you know your engagement helps. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.